there any relevance of native speaker norms? That's a question for TEFLologists. Is it better to focus on form or to focus on forms? That's a question for TEFLologists. If you use a textbook, is your classroom authentic, or should your approach be more learner-centric? From feedback to learner autonomy, we'll discuss it all on TEFLology.
Hi, I'm Matthew.
I'm Rob.
And I'm Matt.
And welcome back to the TEFLology Podcast, a podcast all about teaching English as a foreign language and related matters, presented by three self-certified TEFLologists.
TEFL cultures.
So for this episode's TEFL culture, I thought it would be nice to revisit previous TEFLology culture, if that's okay.
Yeah.
Sure.
I think we discussed English as a lingua franca back in episode 6, but that was many moons ago.
Yes. Yeah, I can't even remember that far back.
Right, and we've learned so much since then. Partly through Matt's recent interview with Jennifer Jenkins, but also just for me, kind of a somewhat of a growing awareness of some of the issues around ELF. So first of all, just to recap, what is ELF?
So in that segment in episode 6, I think I claimed that it was a new variety of English based on the standard kind of forms that were used when second language speakers interacted in English. But when we interviewed Barbara Zeidelhofer and Henry Widowson, we asked them about that, and they said, no, that's totally wrong. So it's more like kind of accommodations to other speakers' forms of English, that kind of thing. Is that right?
That's a big part of it, certainly. Yeah.
I think it's more theoretical than practical.
Okay.
Like, I think that it seems to have had quite a bit of trouble becoming a practical thing. And it seems like more of a theoretical approach to language.
Yep.
There have been some books with the practical slant, but maybe you'll get onto that.
Yeah.
But yeah, like Rob said, I think it's accommodation. I think it's about, English being used by different speakers and the kind of, I guess, the meeting point between their two Englishes, for example.
Yeah.
Perhaps.
Yeah, so just like a bit of the background. As we heard from Professor Jenkins, her interest in it is kind of what sparked the more widespread interest of it, I guess, back in the 90s, I suppose it was. And since then, people like Barbara Zeidelhofer and Henry Widowson have sort of run with it, and there has been a lot of research into ELF. More recently, there's a, I think, annual or semi-annual ELF international conference that takes place, and it seems like it's for some people, for some practitioners and researchers in our field, it's become the main focus of their work. So there has been quite a lot done with it. For Jenkins, she started by focusing on phonology, and as people have pointed out, that's it's kind of a self-contained area, which it's kind of easy to look at. You can record a bunch of examples of what you term ELF interactions. Look at what's happening, what sort of accommodations learners are making in their phonology, and kind of say, oh, that's an example of ELF.
Well, my understanding was that originally Jennifer Jenkins, was kind of moving in the direction of it being a variety, and then it was other people's work swayed her away from that. That's what I understand.
Yeah, I think so. So it has had an interesting evolution, which is, as you mentioned, people have, from its inception, I guess from when it was first coined and made widespread. Anyway, since it's become known amongst a large group of people, there's always been critiques. But as you said, it does feel like those critiques have pushed her and other practitioners or other proponents of ELF to develop it in different directions.
Right.
So they never call, as you say, they never describe it as a variety of English. And it seems much more, at the point it is now, it seems like it's much more descriptive than prescriptive.
Right.
Or it's almost like a critical lens to view interactions.
Yeah. Yeah. So I mean, I think I was very interested in this for a long time. I'm quite still interested in it. And I think that the gap that exists at the moment is, as Matt said, trying to move from theory to practice. So Robin Walker, do you know Robin Walker? No. He wrote a book called Teaching the Pronunciation of English as a Lingua Franca, and I reviewed it for TEFL.net a little while back. And my main concern with it was that the first half of the book was almost like 50% of the book was trying to convince you that this was a good idea in the first place, and then the other 50% was actually about how to teach the pronunciation of English as a lingua franca.
Right. Yeah.
So yeah, I think there's that tension.
I mean, a lot of people who research English as a lingua franca basically say like it's not up to we're not going to try and tell you how this affects the classroom.
Right.
We're just kind of describing what we see out there, which may not be satisfactory to teachers. But there are also people who are looking for more classroom applications, as you mentioned. In terms of definitions, it started out, like a lot of the early definitions, and even up until not too long ago, you'd see definitions as focusing on it as a lingua franca, and what that term originally means, or I guess still means in most contexts. So they describe it as two speakers who do not share an L1 using English to communicate.
Right.
Can you see any problems with that definition?
Well, I guess it depends on their level of proficiency, perhaps, and it depends what you mean by an L1 or an L2.
Right. So there's a lot of, I guess it's widely kind of quoted that most of the English used around the world today is used between non-native speakers of English.
I think 80% is the figure.
Something like that, yeah. And that may be outside of the classroom, but I think in the classroom it's probably it's much lower, I would imagine. It's mostly, and especially in communicative classrooms, it's English used by people who do share an L1, just not English.
Right, okay.
So we teach in mostly monolingual classrooms, but I would certainly describe a class that I have of 8 Japanese students, when they're speaking English, I would describe them as using English as a lingua franca.
Right.
Basically. That makes sense.
Yeah.
So the definition, and a lot of people who've written about ELF have widened the definition to include people who don't share, anybody for whom English is not a first language, interacting in English, then that can be described as ELF.
Why did they include that L1 part in the definition originally? Was it just because was it to do with creating a variety, basically? If it's standard across different language groups, it's not just a case of interference. It's something that's emergent. Is that why they did it?
I think it's because traditionally that's what a lingua franca was used for.
Okay.
Yeah. You wouldn't, obviously our monolingual classes of all Japanese students, if they want to communicate with each other, they're going to communicate in Japanese for the most part.
Right.
We're kind of, for good reasons, I think, we're asking them to communicate in English. But yeah, that's probably why.
Right.
But do you see any issues with this definition of it as just being between 2 non-native speakers of English?
Well, I guess because there's arguments that L1 users also need to learn English as a lingua franca, because the point is for it to be for international communication. If you exclude them from the definition, then you're still privileging them as a group, essentially. They don't have to do anything and everyone else still has to do something. Whereas if it's for an international language and you have to make accommodations, then everyone has to make accommodations, including English L1 speakers.
Yeah. So the definition, I think a lot of modern definitions will also include native speakers, so interactions between native speakers and non-native speakers. And I think Jenkins herself describes it as something that's additionally acquired for both non-native and native speakers.
Right.
What about English interactions such as the one we're having now between native speakers?
Well, obviously you've got like a weird accent from somewhere else, so you should be changing your accent to fit us, because we're the norm here, right?
Yeah.
We're British.
Do you think I'm not changing my accent?
I think you could do more.
Could try a little harder.
Yeah. I think you've got different groups of L1 speakers. So you've got American, Australian. It's a bit like Singlish in Singapore, right? You've got different groups, different language groups who all share Singlish as a common language, but they have to adjust their Singlish to each other because they use different words as part of their Singlish in their communities. So it's a bit like that. You've got speakers from different English-speaking countries or contexts,
Yeah.
and they have to think about the people that they're speaking to and accommodate them in terms of the vocabulary and some of the phrasings and things like that.
Yeah. And then I think it's not too hard from there to make the leap that, you know, within the United Kingdom, people from with different dialects and different varieties of English are going to make some kind of accommodations.
People from different speech communities, basically.
Yeah, basically. So I've seen definitions where they describe it as people with different linguistic relationships to English interacting. But maybe that comes back to that issue of accommodation you guys were talking about. So one of the more kind of interesting, not necessarily critiques of ELF, but maybe like a different way of looking at it, was an article by Andrew Sewell. It's about 5 years old now, but he was when he was approaching ELF, he didn't like, or he was wondering why there is this distinction between ELF and like EFL basically, or any, you know, is there a what makes ELF different from any English communication? Do you think there is a difference?
I'd say every interaction between in English is a lingua franca interaction. Like you said before, even between two people from different parts of the UK, they're still like accepting the variety. There's no like cut and dry. There's no interaction without variety. So everything is accommodation.
Yeah.
Even two people within the same family, probably.
Probably, yeah. I was trying to imagine what would not qualify, but maybe if you cloned yourself and then immediately interacted before you could have separate experiences.
That's why I think English as a lingua franca. It's like, and Jennifer Jenkins talked about English as a lingua franca aware teaching. I think that's more of her route, because she even says herself she doesn't really talk much about the classroom. She focuses more on the theory, but she talks about how we can be more English ELF aware teaching. So I think that does underwrite everything we do.
So how do you think being ELF aware might impact what you do in the classroom?
When you're teaching language, for example, my students often ask, or like when I write things on the board, I default to certain spellings and things like that, and I tend to say to students, so I'm writing it this way. But that's just one way of writing it. Of course, you've learnt another way, and they're both fine, and you don't have to learn both of them really to use.
Okay.
I remember once when I wrote "What's your favourite colour?" on the board for some quite low-level students, and I said I put a grammar mistake into the sentence, and I said, "What's wrong with this sentence?" And they said, "You've spelled colour wrong." And I said, "No, I haven't. It's that's British English spelling. Can anyone spot the mistake?" Another student put their hand up and said, "You spelled favourite wrong." So that's one kind of way.
Well, I've been doing a lot of reading and writing classes recently, and without a doubt, not to generalise, but my students who are mostly Japanese will make the same mistakes. I put mistakes in air quotations, because if they're making the same mistakes, that is some L1 influence on the English. And Jenkins said herself that she often didn't mark those mistakes. She just let them continue. But I think if we always have this academic kind of what's the word, like measurement, if we're measuring them towards an English academic standard, then it's in academic spheres it's quite difficult for ELF to really ELF varieties to build and develop. So I think as a teacher, if you're an ELF aware teacher, you'd see those varieties of their English and maybe let them go, perhaps. I don't know.
But I mean, academic English isn't the kind of English that people normally speak. Like everyone has to learn to speak academic English, as we were talking about when we discussed the Kent Highland paper. It's no one's L1. Academic English is no one's L1.
Right. So then I guess another issue is about when we talk about accommodation, how much of that is on the listener side, like how much onus is on the listener. To be more or I guess specifically talking about, or especially talking about native speakers. Do native speakers need to become more ELF aware?
I'd say so. Well, I heard a story about a conference where the speakers from like Britain and America and so they were the ones that no one could really understand because they just couldn't grade their language in any way. They were not ELF aware essentially, and whereas all the other speakers who were, obviously second language speakers, were much more easy to understand. So.
Well, I'm sure we'll be told about everything we said wrong about ELF this time as well, and it may be 3 more years before we revisit it. But that was this episode's TEFLology. Once again, English as a lingua franca.
TEFL Pioneers.
Today's TEFL Pioneer, connected to the last section actually, is L.A. Hill, which is not a hill in LA, it's a Leslie Alexander Hill. Okay. Have you heard of L.A. Hill?
Nope.
No, I don't think many people have actually, and this is kind of the reason that I chose this particular pioneer. So I came across this book, this very old book, in the office at work, which is called Selected Articles on the Teaching of English as a Foreign Language. It's published in 1967, and it's written by L.A. Hill. And there were a few chapters in here which caught my eye, which I thought were quite sort of pioneering for 1967. So I went looking around at the work of L.A. Hill, and it took a bit of digging, but I found some information, which I think indicates this person was quite ahead of their time.
Okay.
So there's not a lot of biographical information available about L.A. Hill. So born in 1918, apparently, in Britain. I'm assuming no longer with us, because that would make him 98 or 99 years old, or even 100 years old maybe, depending on when he was born. Yeah. He learned 4 languages before the age of 10, apparently. Okay. He worked in all around the world, extensively in Indonesia. He was the head of, on the back of the book it says he was the head of the university's Department of English. There's quite a lot of universities in Indonesia, and I tried detecting which one it was. I couldn't find out, but there were a few candidates. And then in India, he was the British Council's chief education officer for 2 years after that. So he worked in various different locations. In fact, his own children learned Persian, Indonesian, and Hindi, apparently through a naturalistic approach, so that might tell us something about his background, his life. So from searching online, I found that he actually did quite a lot of work. So he was the author of many, many books, including several textbook series like Steps to Understanding, Stories for Reading Comprehension, Cartoons for Learners, and so on. He also wrote a lot of graded readers, and he worked on picture dictionaries, and also wrote some grammar books, so he kind of dabbled in everything. Yeah. And I found a citation in an article by Julian Edge, which led me to an article that he'd written in ELT Journal in 1955, it led me to an article he'd written in the ELT Journal, and then clicking on his name led me to an archive of everything he'd written for them, which went back to 1955. So he started writing for them in 1955, and those articles included things such as the length mark in phonemic transcription, so grammar articles, colour slides in language teaching, so kind of a pedagogical thing, and English in the Commonwealth, the teaching of English in India, which is obviously more of a social point, and also 2 different corticosteroid binding globule invariants that lack cortisol binding activity in a Greek woman, which I think might be a different L.A. Hill. And
was that in the ELT Journal?
Well, it was listed among his publications on their archive.
They used to cast a wider net, I guess.
Maybe. So he wrote a number of articles on grammar and practice, and his interests spanned grammar, classroom practice at all levels, and the politics of language education. So it's someone with a lot of input, a lot of different areas of interest. And there were 2 articles that really stood out for me. So the first one is an ELTJ paper from 1978 called Learning a Language at the Tertiary Level Through a Reading Approach. So I'm going to read you some sections from that, and see what you think about these, and if this connects to any ideas that you're more familiar with. So he says, I've observed many people learning languages at various ages, including my own children, who first learnt Persian, then Indonesian, then Hindi, with no lessons at all, but so perfectly that, unless one looked at them, one would have thought they were native speakers of these languages. I'm therefore still completely convinced, despite research reports to the contrary, that children before the age of about 10 have a great natural facility for learning languages perfectly. that children between about 10 and 18 have the greatest difficulty, and that after about 18, there are some people who, again, can learn languages better, although not as well as children under 10 years old. Yeah. What do you think about that?
It's interesting that he identifies 10. That's usually the cutoff is considered lower than that.
Right. Yeah.
How has his thinking changed now? Like what he was saying then, what's different to the current research on ages and
I'm not sure that
the critical period and stuff like that?
I think usually they talk about like up to 5 or 6 or something for a critical period for language learning.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So he's got different ages, which is just based on his observations, I guess. But what I found interesting was saying after 18, there are some people who can again learn languages better, although not as well as children under 10 years old. So he's saying people can reach a very high proficiency, but not necessarily at the same level you can achieve. Yeah. So it's quite interesting.
Yeah. I mean, I get maybe I wonder if he means like, it's not clear if he means starting at any point before the age of 10.
Right.
Or just like up to 10. You know what I mean?
Yeah. So a little bit later in the same article, he says, to my mind, research reports claiming to show that children between 11 and 18 learn foreign languages more easily than younger children merely show that what they're being made to learn in class is not really a natural command of a language as a means of communication, but some other bag of tricks which older children are naturally better at than younger ones. Does that connect? So this reminded me of something we've discussed before. Does that ring any bells with you?
No.
So this to me, it reminds me of Krashen, of the monitor hype.
Okay.
So the idea that older children, when they're learning languages, they may initially show greater progress than younger children because they have, he calls it a bag of tricks, but it's actually learning strategies and things like that, and the ability to reason your way through the language. So I thought that was quite an interesting little passage. And generally in this, what he's arguing is that you can learn languages through reading, and he talks about his own experiences of learning which languages, Anglo-Saxon and Old Icelandic only through reading. And he says that...
Okay, you probably didn't have much choice, but...
Right, well, yes, yeah. But basically, the way that he lays this out is essentially extensive reading.
Okay.
He's basically describing extensive reading before that term was commonly used. And he has like a well-worked-out system, so there should be vocabulary for each level, giving mother tongue equivalents and explanations, so glossing and so on. So I think this article is quite interesting.
I wonder if Krashen references L.A. Hill.
Possibly.
I mean, this is the kind of input hypothesis as well.
Do you want to check? He's just up there on the shelf, Krashen.
Right.
Yeah, you can check if you want. In the middle of the section.
I mean, I don't think I've seen L.A. Hill referenced a lot.
No, I'm going to go.
Okay.
Yeah. So that's one point that I thought was interesting, the extensive reading and what seems to be sort of presaging some of the other theoretical work. The one that really struck me, though, was in this small book that I mentioned at the start, Selected Articles on the Teaching of English as a Foreign Language. So in here, he has a chapter called Neutral English. Okay? So, the first paragraph. There is a tendency among many teachers of English abroad, especially in Europe and the British Commonwealth, to assume that English is studied chiefly as a means of becoming acquainted with the life, literature, and institutions of the English-speaking peoples. Hence a strong tendency among teachers and textbook writers to try to give a British or an American background to their teaching by providing realia and by introducing their pupils as soon as possible to great English literature. Where do you think he's going with this?
Well, presumably he's going that's not the only reason people learn English.
Right. Yes. Yeah. So he refers actually to Evie Gattenby, who we haven't spoken about, but I think is a possible pioneer for the future. Basically describing the idea that some learners, especially in Asia, for some reason he focuses on Southeast Asia, are not learning English because they want to communicate with people from English-speaking countries, but because they want to communicate with other people from Southeast Asia. And he also says, and so he refers to Gattenby, who says, a Yugoslav student, for example, needs English for utilitarian rather than cultural purposes. He wishes to understand and make himself understood by other Europeans.
So getting some English as a lingua franca.
When was this written?
1967.
Okay.
1967.
So would this go against the sort of the narrative that at that time in the 60s it was still a very kind of British American persuasion, and he's already writing that maybe that's not the case.
Right, and he's referring to Gatenby, who I think this article that he's referring to was written in the early 60s or the late 50s.
Right, but I guess the question then is why is somebody in Yugoslavia, why is English chosen as the lingua franca?
Right. Well, I mean, I guess because of the same reasons that English is a powerful language today.
Right.
Yeah. So he sums up this article by saying, to summarise, I believe very strongly in teaching plenty of literature, life and institutions to the many people who want them, but I also think that we should lend a sympathetic ear to the desires and aspirations of the many others who see in English the answer to their need for an international lingua franca. Right?
So he was calling this at the time neutral language.
He called it neutral English, but he says in the summary he calls it a lingua franca. Yeah. So I think that this might be one of the earliest references to English as a lingua franca as a concept. Yeah.
I mean, I wonder. But in terms of, I'm sure, like as a lingua franca, as we commonly understand the term, I'm sure for a long time people have said, okay, let's, once English reached a certain position in the world, I'm sure it was considered that it was used as a lingua franca.
Right.
But I think what's interesting there is the focus on this maybe neutral type of English where...
Divorced from culture.
Divorced of culture, which is interesting. Just to kind of briefly go back to some of the more recent reading on, or research or writing on English as a lingua franca. Sometimes, so I think, they talk about how it's not possible to have something that's completely culture free. Yeah. But what happens in a ELF interaction between somebody who's not from a native speaking English country is that like a little micro culture is created between those two participants.
Well, I think his intentions with this are a little less than neutral. I think we can say. So he says, 3 paths are open to us. A, we can try to insist on their learning English in the ways that we ourselves want. B, we can withdraw and leave the teaching to others. Or C, we can adapt ourselves to their desires, even if they wish to learn English for different purposes and in different ways from those we may want. And he says, this is another very interesting thing. He says, in the age of strong national feelings, path A is perilous, as if we attach to it English language teaching strings which can be interpreted, however unjustly, as examples of linguistic imperialism. So again, we've got another very modern term there. We risk the danger of its enemies forcing the abandonment of English language teaching lock, stock and barrel. So what he's basically saying is, this neutral English is a way to maintain the English language teaching game, essentially, to keep our hand in the game. Which there was a discussion recently on Twitter about English as lingua franca, where someone referred to it as English as capitalist Esperanto. Which that was quite interesting.
But do you get a sense that he's saying like, let's do this so we can stay in the game, so we can kind of sneakily be linguistically imperialistic, or is he genuine? Like, no, let's, however they want to use the language.
I don't know. It's very difficult to interpret from it. I think at that time there's still going to be this idea that we still want to be involved in this. We don't want to give we don't want to have. But I think just the idea being around in like the mid to late 60s and being expressed in those terms is very, very interesting. And I earlier I had a look through Jennifer Jenkins' books, Barbara Zeidelhofer's books, and even A.P.R. Howart's A History of English Language Teaching, and none of them reference this work by L.A. Hill.
That's interesting.
So I think this is someone who really could do with being reassessed. I think it's someone who's done some very, very interesting things, and referred to lots of things that have become very important modern concepts, like linguistic imperialism and English as a lingua franca. So I think it's a kind of a forgotten pioneer.
Any guesses as to why?
I think because L.A. Hill's work was mainly, it wasn't very theoretical, it was mainly practical. And I mean, again, it's very difficult because there isn't much biographical information. But I think just one of the names that wasn't picked up by people. You know, there's many reasons people don't end up surviving in the theory of the field. But yeah, I think definitely due for a bit of a reassessment. Yeah. So that's this episode's TEFL Pioneer, LA or Leslie Alexander Hill.
TEFL News.
Okay, so for this week's TEFL News, I'd like to talk about a recent journal study that was published in the journal PLOS ONE. It was published in June 2017 by Leon Gomez, Mileva, Little and Roberts. Not Little Robert, Little and Roberts.
Okay.
The title of the study was Perceived Differences in Social Status Between Speaker and Listener Affect the Speaker's Vocal Characteristics.
Okay.
So I'll talk about this study. That's what I'll do today.
Good.
So this study found that men and women generally speak with higher pitched voices to interviewers they think are high in social status.
Right.
Okay.
However, and the study had some different findings, they found that people who thought that they themselves were quite dominant were less likely to vary their pitch and generally spoke in a lower pitch when talking to someone of high social status.
Okay.
So what I'm wondering first is what does this actually sound like? A higher and lower pitch of speaking?
I'd assume it's very subtly higher and lower.
Yeah.
Like, can you give an example?
Hello.
Yeah, because that's what I was thinking. That seems too drastic.
Yeah. Well, I can't because it's very subtle. I assume they've used very sensitive measuring instruments to detect the tones.
Right.
I feel like I've recently heard about a study, like where when men are speaking to women that they find attractive, their voice goes up a little bit.
So is the idea that when people are speaking to someone with higher social status, their voice becomes higher?
Somebody
Perceived differences.
Perceived
Right,
difference.
Yeah.
Right. That's
somebody
really
they want to
interesting.
impress in some way.
Yeah. So so men and women might speak. So it goes on to say men and women who might speak with a higher pitched voices towards high status people because a lower pitched voice sounds dominant. Apparently, particularly in men.
But wouldn't you want to sound dominant?
Yeah.
But if they, I would have thought you would do, but maybe not necessarily.
Maybe we're more conditioned to accept our social statuses than we think.
I think that probably is definitely true.
And it also says higher pitched voices sound submissive. Too,
Okay.
which is quite because like you said, maybe you want to be.
Do you think that's because higher pitched voices sound more feminine?
In
female?
an interview dynamic, do you think it's better to be submissive or dominant?
Depends what job you're going for.
Yeah, or depends why you're being interviewed.
If you're interviewing to be a dominatrix, then
How do you think they did this study? Like, how do you think they conducted this study?
I'd imagine that they mocked up some interviews, or I don't know. Would you mock up an interview, or would you just record interviews?
Yeah.
So I think if you'd mock up an interview and told people you were mocking up the interview, then that would affect your results.
Yeah.
No, they used a ruse to conduct this study.
An unethical form of reason.
Well, let's have a look. So they had 48 participants, which is a fairly large number, I'd say, for this kind of study. Fairly large sample size. To sit at a computer with a headset and web camera pointed towards them in order to test a new form of online interviewing procedure.
Right.
So that's why they were doing the interview.
Okay.
Basically. So they may not have been going for a job necessarily. They were just testing out a new interviewing procedure.
So they were being interviews.
Yeah.
So what did they think they were doing?
They were just testing out a new form of online interviewing procedure.
Was it for a job? Was it a job style interview?
A job style interview,
Okay.
I believe. Yeah, it wasn't for an actual job.
Right,
They were
so
just going through the new procedure, testing it out basically.
But doesn't that invalidate the study a bit if they didn't think they were actually applying for a real job?
Quite possibly, yeah.
Yeah, I wonder. I mean, maybe they, got to the spirit of things.
Well, it says this was the ruse that they mentioned, but they wanted everyone to believe that the interviewers they saw on the screen were real and would be listening and looking at the recordings later.
Okay. So
there's a realistic element to it. I wonder if they were
Yeah.
just going for a general job, like a general kind of recruitment agency interview, where they'd ask them all these general questions.
Yeah. Describe yourself in 3 words.
Yeah.
That's a good one.
The 48 participants, they were presented with an image, name, and job title of an employer, as well as an employee testimonial, and these were all fictitious. So these were all made up.
Right.
Actually, yeah. So to answer your question, I think they were then asked to answer several questions, and there were 3 employers in total, and their images were specifically created using a program called EvoFit. Have you heard of this?
No. It's
and
like a photo fit type thing.
Yeah.
Okay.
To look either dominant or prestigious.
Right.
That's the 2 terms they use here. I think what they mean is they use kind of e-fits basically that would fit a particular image of what dominant is. But then again,
Right.
I think that would change for each person, right?
Yeah.
You know.
I think so. I mean, who's the most dominant out of the 3 of us?
Good question.
Well, you were asking that question, so it's clearly not you.
Who's the most submissive?
Or is it?
Wow.
Wouldn't the truly dominant one just act submissive
Right. Doesn't
and
need
then
to.
manipulate
Yeah.
in the background? In which case it's you.
Yeah. What?
So the 48 participants, they rated the images they rated the images and picked the ones that were very high in dominance or prestige.
Right.
And then they also picked the ones that were quite low on both of these traits, and they were a neutral employer, they were regarded as.
Okay.
So by pairing the images with the testimonials, names and job titles, they were able to create employers who were high in dominance, prestige, and neutral average, basically. And when being interviewed by the dominant or high prestige employers, our participants' voice, they say our, because I think what these researchers have done is they've written a journal article of their study, and then they've written more of a blog post.
Okay.
And for a website called theconversation.com,
Mm-hmm.
which appears to be a website where researchers rewrite their study in a more kind of
more accessible,
conversational way. I think that's what it is. It's quite a good idea, actually. I think podcasts are also a good way to do that sort of thing too. I think their findings show that we subtly manipulate our voices to suit particular social contexts we are faced with, such as talking to a scary employer. And we most likely do this without even thinking about it. These manipulations in turn affect the way we are perceived, just like body posture, the language we use, or our facial shape and expressions. Our voices are part of the arsenal of signals that affect perceptions of social status.
Well, it doesn't surprise me. I think that I've said before that the research into language and gender shows that the ways that people express themselves tend to follow social roles or reproduce social roles. So it's not surprising that that's the case. And people do change their voice. Like, my students, I've actually heard them practicing their telephone voice for when they have jobs, because in Japan, especially female employees, when they answer the phone, they're expected to speak in very high-pitched voices. Not all the time, obviously, but often. So there's a conscious level of that as well, I guess.
This makes me think of the one that I talked about in the past about storytelling and how being a good storyteller makes you more attractive.
Yeah.
It's that kind
Reminds
of
me of a time when...
kind of effect.
Yeah.
And actually, I mean, does this have some, so that point you just made then, Rob, does this have some relation to ELF then as well?
Yeah, I think so, in terms of that, the accommodation you're talking about.
Yeah. I think it could well do.
So we should just call this podcast Accommodation.
Yeah. I'm accommodating your suggestion.
Anyway, that's my TEFL news today, how our voices change based on who we're speaking to. Thank you very much for listening.
If you'd like to get in contact with us, you can send an email to TEFLology@gmail.com. You can also like our Facebook page, follow us on Twitter @TEFLology, and we also have a website, TEFLology-podcast.com, where all of our previous episodes can be found.
So it's goodbye from me.
Goodbye from me.
Goodbye.